All right, let's jump right in. Have you ever wondered how a polite, aristocratic dispute over a vacant throne could somehow spark the brutal dawn of industrialized warfare? Well, welcome to this explainer. Today we're tracing a rapid, completely uncontrollable descent from a simple diplomatic disagreement into a full-blown mechanized inferno. We're looking at the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 to 1871. This is a conflict that didn't just end an empire, it literally rewrote the rulebook on how human beings fight wars.
And it really all begins with this fascinating question. How exactly does one manipulated telegram destroy an empire and forge a brand new one? So here's the setup. The Prussian Prime Minister Otto von Bismarck wanted to unite the independent southern German states with his Prussian-dominated north. But to pull that off, he desperately needed a war with France to rally everyone together. When a diplomatic crisis popped up over a Prussian prince being offered the Spanish throne, the French demanded that the Prussian king, Wilhelm I, guarantee no Prussian would ever rule Spain. The king politely refused and sent a telegram to Bismarck just summarizing the chat. But Bismarck, he saw his trap. He strategically edited this document, which became known as the Ems Dispatch, making it sound like the king had just blatantly insulted the French ambassador, and then he immediately leaked it to the press.
Here is our quick roadmap for today's explainer. 1. The Spanish bomb. 2. Industrializing the battlefield. 3. The disaster at Sedan. 4. The fall of an empire. And 5. The dawn of total war.
Let's start with Section 1, the Spanish bomb, a diplomatic spark. The domino effect here was just staggering. On July 13th, Bismarck manipulates the dispatch. By the very next day, which happens to be the French national holiday no less, it hits the French press. The public is instantly outraged by the perceived insult. By July 15th, the French parliament is completely swept up in war fever and votes for war credits. And just 4 days later, on July 19th, France formally declares war. Think about that. In under a week, Bismarck's cleverly edited telegram successfully provoked Emperor Napoleon III into a war that France was not entirely prepared for.
Moving on to Section 2, industrializing the battlefield, mechanized warfare. The stark reality of 19th century industrial mobilization was heavily skewed. The German alliance, using these meticulously planned train schedules and logistics, deployed roughly 460,000 troops to the front in a matter of weeks. The French Empire, on the other hand, was plagued by totally chaotic mobilization. Soldiers literally couldn't find their own units, depots were sitting empty due to corruption, and they only managed to field about 300,000 men. So before a single shot is even fired, the Germans have a massive manpower advantage. But France actually held a massive trump card, their infantry weapons. The French were armed with the highly modern chassepot rifle. It featured a smaller 11mm caliber, which gave it high velocity, a really flat trajectory, and a much longer effective range. The Prussians? They were still relying on the older Drace needle gun, which fired this heavy, slower 15.4mm bullet. Because of this massive tech gap, German infantry were repeatedly forced into deadly uphill assaults just to get close enough to return fire. They suffered horrific casualties as they tried to close that distance. So you're probably wondering, if the Germans had the worst rifles, how on earth did they win these battles? Well, 2 words: Krupp artillery. The Prussians completely outclassed the French cannons. They were using the modern Krupp 67 cast steel breechloader, which fired highly destructive explosive shells with incredible accuracy and range. The French were still largely relying on older bronze muzzleloaders that would actually deform with heavy use, and they just couldn't match the Krupp guns. Those Krupp cannons essentially became the king of the battlefield, just decimating French positions from miles away. 33,000. Take a second and let that number sink in. That is the number of combined casualties, dead and wounded, from just a single day of fighting at the Battle of Mars-la-Tour on August 16th. Industrial warfare meant that tens of thousands of men could be completely wiped out between sunrise and sunset. And to truly grasp what a statistic like that actually means, we have to look at the visceral reality on the ground. According to Florian Kuhnhauser, a Bavarian infantryman who was there were often whole rows of corpses already giving off an unbearable smell, and thousands of flies busied themselves with the blood which had already turned black. The political leaders back home were using terms like honor and glory, but for the soldiers actually fighting, this conflict was a horrific, bloody meat grinder.
All right, Section 3, the disaster at Sedan, a tactical checkmate.
This disaster built up step by step, kind of like a slow-motion train crash. First, an exhausted French army of 120,000 men, accompanied by Emperor Napoleon III himself, retreated into the town of Sedan. The big problem here? Sedan sits right in a valley surrounded by high hills. One French general bluntly called the place a chamber pot. Second, the German Third and Fourth Armies moved with just incredible speed, bypassing the French and cutting off their escape routes. Third, the trap snapped shut, fully encircling the French. And finally, the devastating blow. The Germans dragged 500 of those superior Krupp cannons up onto the surrounding heights and relentlessly bombarded the defenseless French below. It was a complete tactical checkmate. Trapped, bombarded, and watching his army disintegrate around him, Emperor Napoleon III ordered a white flag raised. He sent a really definitive, tragic note to the Prussian king. It read, "Not having been able to die in the midst of my troops, I have only to place my sword in your majesty's hands." And just like that, with one sentence, the Battle of Sedan ended. An emperor was captured, and the main French army was completely neutralized.
Which brings us to Section 4, the fall of an empire, political shockwave.
The reaction back home was immediate and explosive. Tens of thousands of furious citizens took to the streets of Paris. The Second Empire collapsed almost instantly. The Empress, Eugenie, was literally forced to flee for her life, escaping over to England in disguise. Amidst all this chaos, the Third Republic was proclaimed, with a new government frantically trying to salvage the war effort. And get this, in one of the most dramatic, unbelievable moments of the entire war, the new Minister of the Interior, Leon Gambetta, actually escaped the German siege of Paris by floating over the enemy lines in a hot air balloon. He landed safely and immediately got to work raising massive new citizen armies out in the provinces to keep the fight going.
And finally, Section 5, the dawn of total war, a bitter new conflict.
With the main armies gone, a brand new element entered the battlefield, the Francs-Tireurs. These were irregular French volunteer fighters. They didn't wear standard uniforms, and they definitely didn't fight in open formations. Instead, they engaged in guerrilla warfare, ambushing German supply lines and sniping from local villages. To the Prussian command, this was deeply unsettling. To them, war was something fought between uniformed armies on a battlefield, not against civilians shooting from behind hedges. This entirely blurred the lines between combatant and non-combatant, and it made the war intensely personal and incredibly bitter. What followed was a really dark, grim escalation. The new republic pursued a people's war, and the Germans responded with severe retaliatory measures. We see grueling starvation tactics employed against the civilians trapped inside Paris. We see irregular guerrilla ambushes by the Francs-Tireurs in towns like Ablis. And in response to that, the Germans instituted brutal collective punishments. This included the deliberate, retaliatory burning of entire towns like Châteaudun, and the execution of French civilians who were even suspected of aiding the partisans. The source material paints a very stark, chilling picture of this escalation. Take a listen to this official German military report following a partisan ambush at Ablis. It reads, "The women, children, and old people were given time to leave. Men were mercilessly shot or cut down. This conflict was no longer a traditional 19th century clash of monarchs. It was rapidly spiraling into a war of societal exhaustion and the targeted destruction of non-combatants." So that leaves us with a really massive question to chew on. Did the ashes of Châteaudun and the grueling, starvation-driven siege of Paris set the stage for the catastrophic total wars of the 20th century? The Franco-Prussian Wars started with a polite diplomatic squabble between aristocrats, but it ended with mass conscription, industrialized slaughter, and guerrilla warfare. It birthed a united German empire, yes, but it also planted the seeds of bitter national hatred that would eventually erupt onto a global scale just a few decades later. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. I really hope these details helped bring this incredibly pivotal moment in history to life for you. Keep questioning and keep learning.